I've made several videos about the importance of systems thinking, and you may be thinking,
Sounds great. But how do I actually do systems thinking?
well, I could advise you go on the internet and read a lot of articles, but having done that, I know it'll just make your eyes glaze over because most of it's written by men and they make it way too complicated.
Men in our workplaces believe systems thinking depends entirely on men's traits and therefore must happen in the blue zone. But that's not true. To do systems thinking, our workplaces need to add women and our pink zone traits. This is the only way systems thinking is possible.
So, as women, if we know how to assert our female ways of thinking and doing things, then systems thinking is super easy.
Let's start by understanding that we all have a job that requires us to do various tasks, and none of us works autonomously. In other words, we don't work alone on a desert island where we have to do all of our tasks all by ourselves. Instead, our workplaces give us coworkers, and we depend on our coworkers to do their job right so we can then do our job right. Likewise, other coworkers depend on us to do our job so they can then do their job. All of this interaction and dependency on each other creates systems. And as we do our different tasks, we work in different systems.
Today, our workplaces know they use systems, but they struggle to focus on their systems because they're so entrenched in the blue zone and they put way too much emphasis on individuals and their task expertise.
Consequently, our workplaces organize into functional silos based on expertise. They assume each silo is an expert in its function and knows the best way to complete the task. So as work flows from function to function, the blue zone allows each function to modify the task based on its expert opinion. Consequently, functions lose their connection to the larger system, which then disrupts the flow of work, creating rework and a loss of productivity.
Our workplaces keep things too disconnected. Let me give you an example. Throughout my career, I oversaw the financials that were created by the operations system and the financials that were created by the finance system. Because they were separate systems, they produced different financial results. Which is correct? Or are they both wrong? The biggest consequence of all this disconnection is that our workplaces don't really know how well they're functioning. They think everything's going just great, when in reality, they're on the Titanic heading straight for that iceberg. Our workplaces get into these dire straits because their systems aren't functioning properly, and management, they're oblivious to it. But as employees, we know when the systems aren't working right because they make our job harder. We know the systems cause us to make mistakes, cut corners, and fudge things just so we can get our job done. We know when we're not doing our best, but then we think,
If management doesn't care enough to make the system work right and make my job easier, then why should I?
so why isn't management paying attention to the systems?
Well, it's because managers have a blue zone concept of management that tells them they're above getting down in the weeds and understanding how systems function. The blue zone encourages managers to break connections, while systems thinking requires creating connections.
So to do systems thinking, the first thing we must do is think differently.
We must push aside our blue zone training and indoctrination and give ourselves permission to explore and assert our pink zone traits. When we do this, we discover the connections that are critical for systems thinking.
As women, we've always struggled to understand the value our pink zone traits bring to the workplace because men and their blue zone thinking have dominated the workplace for centuries. However, as I point out in my video, complexity is a bitch and a feminist. The world has changed dramatically because everything's become more complex. And the only way to effectively deal with complexity is to use systems thinking. So, when we think differently, we acknowledge that the blue zone can't do systems thinking and can't deal with complexity by itself. It needs the help of our pink zone traits. However, many of us don't want to think differently because we've listened to a bunch of misguided narratives telling us that we shouldn't do anything different from our male colleagues. These narratives tell us we must become blue zone women in order to be equal to men. But there's a problem with that. Since the blue zone is based on male thinking and male ways of doing things, our male colleagues will naturally demonstrate the traits our workplaces value. That gives them a big advantage over us. And no matter how hard we try, we're not going to out blue zone our male colleagues. So in order to level the playing field, we need to bring something incredibly valuable to the workplace that they can't. What we can bring are our pink zone traits that allow us to implement systems thinking and then deal with complexity far better than our male colleagues. So the second thing we must do to implement systems thinking is actually the hardest. We must accept that we are different from our male colleagues and we don't use the blue zone behavior our workplace expects.
Since we are different, we must also accept that when we assert our pink zone traits, our male colleagues won't understand what we're doing. However, when we assert who we are and stand up for our way of doing things, we are drawing on the blue zone's autonomy, and our male colleagues, they'll recognize that. As women, our autonomy can make us feel very uncomfortable. It can make us feel like we're all alone on a desert island. This is why we have to believe in who we are and what we're doing. We have to believe our traits give us the power to improve our workplace, to advance our careers, and to discover our unique value.
Once we get past our natural discomfort, the next thing we do to implement systems thinking is super easy. We're going to dive deep into the pink zone and talk to our male colleagues about our jobs. Now, if you've ever been in a pink zone workplace, a workplace that's all women, you notice that we continuously interact and talk about our jobs. We talk about what we're working on, the problems we're having, and we have no trouble asking each other for help and advice. Men, however, they don't talk this way. It's against their blue zone rules of engagement.
In the blue zone, when men talk about work, they'll talk about what Bob is doing, laugh about how Joe screwed up, discuss how a project is going. But because of autonomy, they don't talk to each other about their own jobs. If a man talks about his job, he destroys his autonomy and standing as a man. Men, however, don't have a problem talking to women about their work or anything else. So when men have a problem, they come to women for help, knowing that we're free to talk to everyone and we'll come up with an answer. So as women, we hold the power to raise issues and unite our workplace in resolving them.
I began talking to my male colleagues about a problem in my job when I kept getting information I had to transpose before I could use it. It was frustrating, and I kept wondering, why can't I just get this in a format I can use? Now, since I got this information from my colleague Pete, I decided to go talk to him. Now, I want to be very clear about how we talk to a colleague about a problem. We never blame the person. We never say things like,
Pete, you are formatting this wrong and you are making my job harder.
Instead, we always blame the system. Everything is the system's fault. We don't have problems because people are incompetent. We have problems because of the way people are required to do their job.
So I showed Pete my problem and said, when I get this, I have to transpose it before I can use it. Can we change the format? Pete replied that he gets the information in that format from Greg, and he just uses a few numbers from the sheet, then passes it on to me. He didn't care about the format. So I said, well, let's go talk to Greg and see if we can come up with a better format. I explained my problem to Greg. At first, Greg was hesitant to change the format because he never thought about doing his job differently. He was also worried that any change to help me would create more work for him.
We have to remember that people resist change because they fear that a change will make their situation worse. Therefore, it's critical that we build a relationship with our colleagues and that they trust that we will only accept a win-win solution. To build that relationship, the next thing we do is we get down into the weeds. We dive down into the details of how they do their job so we understand what they deal with, and have compassion for it.
I asked Greg to show me how he uses the information in his job. As he talked, Marco overheard us and came over. He told us that he compiles the raw numbers into the format Greg uses, and that he made up that format so he could change it. Greg, of course, was concerned that a format change would make his job harder. So the four of us dove down into the details of our jobs and in less than an hour developed an entirely new format that worked for all of us, especially Greg, because we eliminated all the problems he dealt with and always accepted as part of his work. My colleagues experienced a mental shift. They no longer accepted the hardships built into their job because they knew they had the power to change and improve how they did their job. A few days later, Marco asked me to go with him to talk to Pete about a problem he had. So we met with Pete, made changes, and improved how they did their tasks. Then Pete asked for my help with the problem he was having with another department. And again, I agreed to help him.
Yes, I got involved in a lot of issues that didn't concern me, but I also learned a lot about how my workplace functioned as a whole. And that brings me to my next point. Stop thinking vertically. Think horizontally.
The Blue Zone teaches us to move up in our careers within our own department and area of expertise. However, the best senior managers engaged in career broadening. They worked in many different departments, learning how each one functioned so they understood the entirety of their workplace and industry.
I spent the first years of my career doing a lot of career broadening. Then a management position opened up and oh my God, I wanted that job. I was already familiar with all the systems and processes the area used, and I knew that they were all broken and the area functioned in chaos and crisis management. I couldn't think of a better opportunity to experiment with systems thinking and find out just how powerful it was. So I made a passionate sales pitch, and with the support of the people who worked in the area, I got the job. And boy, did I walk into a mess. Now you may be thinking that once you're a supervisor or a manager, it's easier to implement systems thinking. But I want to point out that anyone can implement systems thinking and improve their workplace processes. Having management involvement is nice, but it's not critical. Workforce involvement is critical. The workforce must be involved because they are the experts on the systems and they know what does and doesn't work. Unfortunately, though, most of the workforce has no idea what systems thinking is or how to do it. So as a manager, I made teaching systems thinking part of my job. This meant that I had to interact a lot with my staff, so I made sure my office was located close to them or I spent a lot of time in their work location.
I listened for when my staff experienced a problem and then asked them to show me the problem. I dove down into the weeds to understand how they did their job.
Many people believe that since I'm the manager, I'm responsible for coming up with a solution and then I direct my staff to implement it. But that's Blue Zone thinking. In systems thinking, I want my staff to think their way through the problem and solve it themselves.
As the manager, my job is to guide them through the process and make them feel empowered. So, when they solve the problem, they experience a mind shift and realize they can change and improve their job. Once I worked through a few problems with different groups, the flywheel starts spinning and people believe they can improve how they work. It then becomes time to take our systems to the next level and hold process meetings.
Now, if the people you work with are like the people I work with, they hate meetings because most meetings are a freaking waste of time. So to entice them to attend, I let them know that we were meeting to resolve a problem, and I let them decide which problem we would tackle. I also used the power of food. I always made sure there was food at our meetings because when there's food, men come out of the woodwork. Also, because of the nature of our work, I held our meetings at lunchtime, with lunch first, followed by our problem solving.
You can order pizza for lunch, but that gets old. If you talk to your staff, you find out that even the men like to cook and that most people have a favorite recipe they love to show off and share. By sharing a meal together first, we bonded. We talked to each other, joked around, and had fun. It put everyone in a good mood, so we were willing to work together as a team to solve a problem.
When it's time to tackle an issue, we encourage everyone to participate because it takes all perspectives to create a whole solution. You never know who has that critical piece of information that makes all the difference between a process working and not working. Here's an example.
I invited my admin to a meeting about a construction process. She questioned why she had to attend, and I told her to just wait. After the guys worked out their process, I asked her, "Will that work?" She replied, "No," and explained why. She then provided the critical step the guys had missed.
So exactly how do we conduct a process meeting? Well, we stay out of the blue zone because we want the workforce to think their way through the process and create it themselves. As the leader/facilitator, I just ask a lot of questions and I don't give any answers. I just keep asking more in-depth questions.
I begin by simply asking, "What happens first?" And then I keep asking, "What's next?" So we build the steps in the process. Then to make everyone think deeper, I ask questions like, "Who does that? Who else needs to be involved? How do you do that? When does that happen? Where does that come from? Who decides that? What if that doesn't happen? And is that realistic?"
As we go through the process, we want everyone to voice their expertise, especially if we're talking about their task. We don't want any wallflowers or spectators. So as we go through the process, I keep asking the question, does that work for everyone or do we need to change anything? Anne, does that work for you? Steve, do we need to change anything?
As we answer questions, we lay out the steps of the process. Sometimes we forget steps and have to go back and correct the process. As we talk, we see how we are all connected in our work, and we look for opportunities to simplify the process or make it more efficient so we make everyone's job easier. After the meeting, we write up the process and make it available and accessible to everyone. I also like to post important processes on the wall for easy reference.
In all of my workplaces, everyone used the processes they developed. Sometimes, however, after we used the process for a while, we thought of better ways to work, or the conditions changed. So we then modified our process. I also moved to different workplaces within my industry, so the processes I was used to had to be tailored to fit my new workplace. The point is, our processes are never locked in. Once they're developed, they're subject to continuous improvement because we're always looking for a better way to work.
As women, our pink zone traits connect us to our colleagues and make us care about them. So when we see them struggle or get stressed and frustrated, we want to do something to help. Systems thinking gives all of us, whether we are the lowest level nobody or the top dog, a way to do something. It puts our caring into action, and we realize no one is better suited to improve our workplace than us.
So do systems thinking in your workplace and do it like a woman.
This is Dot Callahan asking you to help me turn the woman in the room into the women in the room. Sign up for my newsletter, subscribe to my YouTube channel, or follow the Woman in the Room on social media. It's up to you. Just keep watching and sharing my videos to get advice from a woman who's been there, dealt with that, and knows what works.